it's Candice Stringham, and I'm here today to give a quick tutorial on a question that I get asked by a lot of students who are new to DSLR photography. And that is a question on shooting modes, or what do all those icons and letters mean on the top of my camera dial? Most people only use one or two of them or have an understanding of a few of them and want to know what the rest of them mean or do. So we're going to talk about those today, and we will be talking about both Canon and Nikon. So whichever camera family you belong to, you should be able to follow along. Your dial might be slightly different depending on if you have a higher end or a lower end camera within those brands, but they're pretty much the same. We'll start off with the most basic of settings, which is what your camera comes on, and that is the auto setting. For Canon, that is a little green rectangle. For Nikon, that's an icon of the camera with auto above it, so it's pretty self-explanatory. And basically what auto means is your camera is choosing all the settings for you. So it has complete control over your exposure. The next setting is a setting that a lot of people get a little bit confused on. What's the difference between program and then auto? Program mode, the camera will choose settings for you, but then you have a lot of opportunities to kind of switch things up. So you can change your ISO, you can turn off the flash, you can adjust white balance, and you can change the aperture and the shutter speed, but only as a pair. So the camera will give you a suggestion, and then you can change them, but you have to change them together. You can't change the settings individually. It's very similar with Nikon, and it's also represented by the P on your camera dial. The next thing we're going to move to on Canon is TV, which stands for time value, but what it really is shutter speed priority, and that means you get to pick the shutter speed and the camera picks the other setting, your aperture, to give you an exposure. So you have control over the shutter speed on shutter speed priority. On a Nikon, that's just represented by an S, so it's a little bit simpler. The next setting is AV, or aperture value, which stands for aperture priority, and that is the opposite of shutter speed priority. Now you're picking the aperture, and your camera will then pick a shutter speed to go with it. On Nikon, it's simply represented by an A. The next setting is the big dreaded M by most people, and that is manual mode. And in manual mode, you have complete control over everything. So you can change your aperture, you can change your shutter speed, your ISO, your white balance. Any of those settings that you want to adjust, you're able to adjust in manual mode. The camera doesn't just leave you completely alone to figure it out, though. It does have a built-in light meter that can help you calculate and figure out what settings will work best to give you a good exposure. And we learn all about those in Oh Shoot, which is our DSLR 6-week course on JessicaSprague.com. So if you have questions about these terms, aperture, shutter speeds, all these settings and what they mean, you can take that class with us, and we'd love to have you. Okay, it's still represented by an M on Nikon, so you can find manual mode right there. Now, Canon has a few settings that Nikon doesn't have on their dial. The first is ADEP, which stands for Automatic Depth of Field. And depth of field means the depth in your image that is in focus. So how much of the depth is in focus in your image. And it's a setting that you actually change by setting a focal point in the foreground and then a focal point in the background that you want both in focus, and then the camera will then choose an aperture that's going to do that for you. The next things you'll see on the Canon side of things is the custom shooting modes, or sometimes it's referred to as camera user settings. So you'll see it listed both ways at different places. And basically what it means is you can preset a group of settings that you like to use often. So say every time you go to shoot a landscape, you know you want the same aperture and shutter speed. You're always in the same lighting situation. You could set those or preset them to C1, C2, or C3, and then just switch your dial to that and automatically get those settings. So you don't have to kind of quickly adjust everything if you know it's a common setting that you like to use. We're going flip around on the dial and go to the icons now, and the first icon on the dial is portrait mode. It's a little profile of a woman on Canon, and basically what that means is that it's choosing a wider aperture, a relatively wide aperture, to blur out the backgrounds, because in portraits we want the person to be nice and sharp, but the background to be a little bit softer so that they're separated and they really stand out in the image. And portrait mode can help you do that if you don't completely understand apertures and want to mess with that on your own. On Nikon, that's represented by another silhouette of a woman wearing a hat. Landscape mode is kind of the opposite. It'll set a small aperture to keep more in focus, because when you're photographing a landscape, you want everything nice and sharp. You want the mountains, you want the sky, you want the trees in the foreground, all nice and sharp. So in landscape mode, your camera is picking a relatively small or closed aperture to keep more in focus. It also changes your colors slightly. It'll add in a little extra blue and green, because generally in a landscape it's either water or trees and grass that we want to have those nice, vibrant, saturated colors. So it'll add that in slightly. On Nikon, you'll see it also as a little icon of mountains. Now the next setting is a setting that only Nikon has. Canon doesn't have this setting, and it's the child mode, or the child movement mode. And what it does is it switches focusing systems within your camera to track movement. So if you're photographing a toddler and they're running around and you're having a hard time keeping them in focus, the tracking of the movement can help. It can also be challenging, but it's meant to be helpful. And it does give you more vibrant colors, but keeps those skin tones nice and pure. So that's the child mode on Nikon. Okay, the next setting is sometimes referred to macro mode, but also referred to as close-up mode. And the reason they refer to it as close-up mode as opposed to macro mode, which so often people call it, is because you can't have a true macro mode without a macro lens. But what close-up mode does is allows you to get a little bit closer in your focusing, and it also helps keep your aperture relatively closed so that you have a little more depth of field to play with as you're photographing close-up objects. So anytime you want to photograph something a little bit closer, that can be helpful. But again, it's not truly macro mode without a macro lens. The next setting we're going to talk about is sports mode. That's the icon of the little man running. And it tries to pick a relatively fast shutter speed so that it can freeze movement based upon the lighting situation. And that's helpful if you're photographing cars racing down the street, or runners at a track meet, or dancers. We want to be able to freeze their movement and their motion, and sports mode can help you with that. It's also a person running on Nikon, so it's very similar on both cameras. We're going to talk about night portrait mode next. You might be wondering what's the difference between taking a portrait during the day and at night, and obviously it's the lack of light. And so often when you take photographs with your camera and that little pop-up flash, the background completely goes away at night because the flash can't reach it, and so you have a dark background with a brightly lit subject. Night portrait mode tries to sort of correct that. What it does is it combines your flash with a slower shutter speed so that you'll get some of that available light in the background. It can be tricky to use, but it is fun to play with, and it is represented by a little person with a dark background and a star. And that's the same on Canon and Nikon. The last thing you'll find on your dial is the no flash mode, which is just a little like lightning bolt arrow crossed out, and that just means that you're able to turn off your flash and not use your flash if you don't want it on. It's the same thing on the Nikon. So hopefully that helped explain a little bit to you about your shooting modes and that dial on the top of your camera. But if you have more questions, like I said, about apertures and shutter speeds, when you would pick one over the other, and hopefully you'll get rid of using all those little icon modes and go strictly to your manual and your shutter speed and aperture priority, and learn a lot about your camera, because you're going to get a much better experience and much better images if you know how to truly use that great DSLR you bought. So hopefully you'll join us in Oh Shoot at JessicaSprague.com.